so that we younger men and also the people listening or with the pamphlet will understand the character of the figures involved in the Austrian school.
Yes.
And my first question that I had was on Menger. What was his? He did not, as you say, he did not want to publish, and yet he had enormous impact of the ideas. What was the character of Menger as a teacher or a personality which made ideas carry forth even though he wrote so little?
Well, that's a question I've often asked myself. See, I hardly knew Menger. I've seen him a single time when he was about 80, long retired, marching in an academic profession. And the comic part of the story is when later I wrote a biographical essay on him, editing his works, there's one single sentence which is based on my own experience, and that is the only one which is wrong. Because he made a very impressive figure, so I described him as a tall man, and afterwards everyone told me, you are wrong, it's quite medium-sized. But for such an impressive figure, having seen him, I described him as a tall man. Now that his seminar, which ceased as early as 1903 when he retired, a small group of very intelligent people, and as was the Vienna tradition, associated with regular meetings with his former teacher and former students who were already occupying important positions in a coffee house, created a Menger circle. At the end of the century, it had largely vanished. That was dominated the first third of last century, but since Menger retired in 1903, very little was left beginning of this century. Then during World War I, the most powerful personal figure among his students, Böhm-Bawerk, also died. And so died the great textbook expositor, Filipovich. And indeed, even the third man, who ultimately became my teacher, Friedrich von Wieser, headed in one of the last governments of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, being Minister of Trade, so a temporary university. So when I came back from the war in 1918, was not a single one of the great features teaching. In fact, economics was in charge temporarily, rather comically, of an economic historian who was a socialist and became later the founder of the famous Marxist Freudian Frank Institute of Social Research. But Wieser came back.
Who was that? I don't know.
Grünberg is his name. Karl Grünberg. Later people in the Frankfurt Institute were the representative figures of Marx-Freud tradition in the 19th century. But he himself was an economic historian inclined in that direction. Scholarly head for something which became a very political institution, but wholly uninteresting to us. And there was Wieser, who came back and became still my teacher. And Mises, who was what's called a present, an unpaid man who had the license to teach at the university, to earn his living as a secretary of the Chamber of Commerce. Now, please be discreet about this point because it raises very touchy problems. But it is commonly believed, and Mises himself asserted it, that he was never given a position because of anti-Semitism. It's not as simple as this, because half the law faculty consisted of Jews. So the problem why Mises didn't get a professorship is a very peculiar one. And my answer to this, which I don't think has ever been stated, but which I will tell you is, in order for a Jew to get a professorship, he had to have the support of his Jewish fellows. Any other Jews who were sufficiently eminent to be supported, because all the appointed Jews could get a professorship. But the Jews who were teaching were all socialists, and Mises was an anti-socialist. So he could not get the support of his own fellows. So the reason why he did not get a professorship was not really anti-Semitism, but he wasn't liked by his Jewish colleagues. It's a very comic story, and which I tell you, this hesitation, because it's something you cannot prove. I'm quite certain it's correct from my knowledge of the position. But the Vienna of the 1920s and 1930s is not intelligent without the Jewish problem, which was not a problem simply of Christians and Jews, but a very large middle group in between the two, partly of baptized Jews, partly of Christians who had made friends with the Jews, and there was close contact between the purely Christian group, the mixed group, and again between the mixed group and the Jewish group, but not between the two extremes. And I became very much aware of this quite a recent time ago, and I was asked whom of the great figures of Vienna I had known at the time. Have you known, for instance, Schrödinger? Yes, of course. Wittgenstein? Yes, of course. And so on. Then he came to Freud. No, Freud, I couldn't possibly have known Freud. Why? Because he belonged to the Holy Jewish group, and that was beyond my reach of acquaintances. I had a great many very close acquaintances in the mixed group. I constantly moved in it. But to have met somebody in the purely Jewish group was so unlikely that being told that because I was a Viennese, I ought to have known Freud seemed to be absurd.
Was not Freud a private docent for many years himself, and was Freud also private docent?
Oh yes, oh yes.
When did he ever take a university position?
Never, you know. Both Mises and Freud had the title professor, but it was purely a title. They were Privatdozenten, had the license to teach, what the Privatdozent means, and were finally decorated for being called professor, but never received a penny from the university.
It's remarkable that two of the most important minds of Vienna were unable to teach.
A very large number. And not only people,
they taught, but
in the majority of instances, they were Jewish, but not only Jews, people who had highly unpopular views, but were recognized in a way, would get a license to teach, but not a regular professorship.
Now, I have a question on this mixed group. Is this another religious group, or what do you mean a mixed group?
Mostly Christian Jews. And Jews and Christians who were not anti-Semites.
Oh, I see.
Who readily mixed with each other. And it was on the margin of the two pure groups, there was an intermediate group of people who very readily mixed and knew each other. Means the extreme Jew and the extreme Christian would hardly communicate with the other side.
Weren't you? You were a relative of Wittgenstein, are you not?
Yes, but Wittgenstein was Jewish. It so happens that, please, this is off the record.
Fine.
I will tell you this stuff. The first I heard of Wittgenstein was when I was a very small boy, and one of my aunts, of my stern country ancestors, once remarked, "Grandfather has sold his daughter to a Jewish banker in Vienna." That was how the relation to the Wittgensteins ever came about.
I see. All right.
But they were completely established in Vienna society. As in general, the Jewish problem in Vienna became acute only as a result of the recent emigration from Poland. There was an old established Jewish population in Vienna, partly of local origin, partly of Hungarian or Bohemian origin, were fully accepted and recognized. The violent anti-Semitism occurred when very primitive, poor Polish Jews immigrated already before the war and partly in flight from the Russians during the war. Vienna became filled with a type of Jew which hadn't been known before, in the kaftan, the long beard and all that, which we hadn't even seen before. And it was against them that the violent anti-Semitism arose.
And was that in the 20s?
Huh?
1920s or 30s? Or what
Well,
period?
Still during
What period?
During the Great War,
World War I.
it developed
Okay.
during the 30s. But the immigration occurred during the First Great War.
So you regarded yourself as this mixed group. You didn't.
Not my family is purely on the purely Christian group, but in the university context, I entered into the mixed group.
Yeah.
Do you think, was Menger equally respected by all scholars of the period? Was he seen as a
Menger
profound,
would be.
a penetrating mind?
Menger would be, and as I said, during the 1970s, the 1870s, and to the end of the century, the division was not yet so sharp. Menger himself made himself, before he became a professor, a reputation as a journalist, which was in Vienna a largely Jewish profession. So he was very much respected in the Jewish intellectual circle. Now, Menger's story, I ought not to anticipate too much, because I have now a great deal of information, what is still a confidential document. Menger's son, the mathematician, is producing a biography, which I have read in manuscript, which is not yet published, so I mustn't give away too much.
Well, can you tell us? Can you show us on this map any highlights of Menger's life that we should note? Like you were saying, now he was wasn't he the finance minister of?
No. He was only for many years tutor of the Archduke Rudolf, the son of Francis Joseph, who committed suicide in the end. And through that, he had intimate contacts. But apart from this, he refused every official position. In contrast to his successors, the Böhm-Bawerk was for many years Minister of Finance, and Wiese in the end had to come in more as a figurehead at the very end of the old empire.
Mises believes that a suicide, he says in his notes and recollections, he believes it was the pessimism about the future which had been imparted to him from Menger, which led to the suicide, that it wasn't the relationship with the girl, but he despaired about the liberal future. Do you think that Mises is exaggerating that?
Yes, it certainly contributed greatly. I wouldn't dare to make as simple a statement of any one cause, but this was a very strong contributory factor. Rudolf, the Crown Prince, had been made by Menger a 19th century liberal, very much in conflict with the Austrian then ruling tradition. His attempts to reform it proved unsuccessful. The chance of his father living on forever, as it turned out to be true, that he had no prospect within the foreseeable future to do anything about it, was quite enough to put him in a state of very deep depression. I believe the immediate cause was something quite different, but that his basic depressive view of the world, which made him ready for suicide, was due to his seeing the world in the light of a 19th century liberal, which Menger had made him. Menger's influence on him was evidently, I gather now from the biography of his son, very much greater than I had imagined. Mises, who couldn't have known this except by stories, is evidently right.
The influence of the seminar was very great. Menger's, von Beauverk's, and the meetings that Mises had in the 20s.
It's different.
What were the differences?
The Menger seminar did not produce mainly academics. From the Menger seminar emerged quite a number. Menger started too late to have his immediate successors, von Babek and Mises, as his students. Mises and von Babek had just completed their studies when Menger, and were already out of the university by the time he started teaching.
Now stop. I'm confused on the I'm confused here. Which book are we speaking of?
The Grundsätze.
And that was published in the
71.
All right. Now that was the beginning of his published. Now I'm getting it. Of the published career.
Yes.
Mises was. Didn't he get his degree about 1906?
Oh, yes.
Or thereabouts? And
Mises is already post-Mengerian.
all right.
Mises was never a direct pupil of Menger.
And Wieser and
Von
von Beauverk came on the faculty, or were they both students in that seminar
No.
with Menger? They were not.
They had already graduated
All right, I see.
and gone as graduate students to Germany before Menger was appointed.
All right.
Menger assisted them because he found in them the first people who believed in his book. But they were no longer students at that time.
All right.
And from the mid-70s, when Menger began to teach, to 1903, when he retired, his seminar produced a substantial number of distinguished high civil servants and statesmen. It had as a seminar, and through his coffee house around, a considerable influence on the upper intellectual level of Vienna.
And you say that coffee house is gone now? Do we know where it was?
Do we have a
No, I'm not sure. I believe I know. Do you all know Vienna at all? Not yet.
Not really. I brought this map of the central part of Munich. Will that help?
Well, the main...
Because here's the university, I think.
If this is the university, this block of houses has at both ends coffee houses. This is a more popular one. This is the one specially favored by the economists. But it was quite regular that, for instance, professors would meet their students after the lecture. After the lecture in the coffee house. I'm not sure which coffee house Menger frequented. In this century, It was this one, which no longer exists.
Which one? This
Try
one?
to get the two names. This is called Landmann. This was called the Künstlercafé, the artist's coffee. The Land exists. It's the older history. Used to be the general resort. The Künstlercafé on the other side became specialized to the economists, in particular to some of them who had the habit of practically spending their life in the coffee house.
Do we need to get the spelling of those?
Yes, perhaps we should get the spelling so that we can. Sure, write it down. Take that.
Get the spelling of both of those.
Did students meet with the senior professor over
Well,
coffee?
the professors would have, one typical instance I knew very well, with an early morning lecture, we would take coffee there, and the students would come if they wanted to consult the professor. They should be the students. For the students, the coffee was very moderate, too luxurious a place to go to, while the Vienna coffee house, of course, where in fact you could spend a day paying for a cup of coffee, was very attractive for intellectuals, but of a slightly higher level than the actual student. The student got the thing even still cheaper in the university. But the professor, who after his lecture retired to his cup of coffee, would receive professors. I suspect, but I do not know, that like many slightly older, younger men I knew, many also would have met his people at the Café Landmann. But in Menger's case, the main important was that not students, but ex-students met regularly in a kind of circle discussing current politics, while Menger never became active in current Austrian politics as an influence, and the intellectual heart of 19th century liberalism became very, very important. And even high civil servants who would have been his students in the 1870s, would in the 1890s, or the beginning of the century, still regularly come once a week for a conversation with Menger. That became the heart of what it's so difficult today. You can't talk to Americans about liberalism without the understanding what it means.
Well, we'll footnote your article to it where you explain it, and that will be enough. So we know what we mean, so you go ahead.
Then, in fact, if you have to explain it, you might almost say that in 19th century continental Europe, liberalism meant in America conservatism means today. That is roughly the right definition. And in this sense, in opposition against the advanced interventionism and even socialism of the government, the Menger group remained a Gladstonian liberal group in Europe of great importance. And he remained the inspirer of all sorts of, there's no point I couldn't from memory to mention the people in high public positions to whom Menger was the orator, the wise man available.
Did those men at a later date achieve important positions or influence to either turn the thinking of the public, or at least of the other ministers, away from the interventionism? Or did they, if they did, when did their influence end? Was it during the war?
When they died.
Well, all right.
Or retired.
All right. And when was that? In the 30s, the 20s?
In the second and third century of this,
All right.
let's say the decade of this century. I will say the first and the second, was very little left when Austria collapsed. People were still about, but they were retired and it lost influence.
What about von Berg's seminars? Let's talk about those.
Well, that is quite different here. This was the center of the academic development. That was a place where the Bavarian and Wieser, as you will read, were wholly different characters. It's very curious. They were exact companions, school fellows, university colleagues, brothers in law, working on the same subject, going together to German university, but with a wholly different scientific attitude. I've once written an essay on the title Two Types of Mind, which is partly modeled on this Bavariak's the absolute master of his subject.
Yes.
He knew the answer to everything at once. Anything which had been said before, he knew.
Yes.
A clear conception of it all.
And Wieser was the puzzler.
With a tendency to simplify, not to avoid real difficulties.
Yes.
Wieser, a slow, thoughtful person, to whom nothing was simple, was all frightfully difficult, who hated discussing anything, because he had to give a quick answer. You want to think about everything else. So much so to tell an episode, which is rather amusing. Sometime before World War I, for a while, the English economist Alfred Marshall and Wieser happened to go for summer holidays to the same place in the South Tyrol, the Dolomites, and nodded to each other year after year, polite, but never had any wish to discuss economics. Then Bavariak came on a visit, brought them together, insisted that they discuss economics. They all reported that a very exciting day, but neither Wieser nor Marshall ever went to the same place again.
Where was this?
In St. Grödner Valley in the Dolomites.
Was Wieser more like Frank Knight in the way he went about things?
Oh, yes. I have, in fact, in that essay which I mentioned about two types of mind, in a footnote given Weiner and Frank Knight as a similar pair.
Yes.
To this.
Wieser's, we hear very little of his students. We hear more of von Berg's students. Is there a reason for that?
Oh, yes. In the seminars were wholly different affairs. Von Bavariak's seminars were highly exciting. He had, apart from the main original thinkers of his own school, a good many of the socialists of the time, people like Otto Bauer and forget all the names, with violent discussions going on. What was discussed in Bavariak's seminar was discussed all over the university. Wieser's seminar would be quietly on one neat problem, carefully prepared paper, which then picked to pieces, was very far away from any topical issue of any kind. The Bavariak seminar ended before World War I. He died in 1914 or 15. I have only known the Wieser seminar. It was interesting from a purely theoretical point of view, but nobody could be very excited about it.
Were you in both? Did you have no.
Of course, when Bavariak died, I was 16.
Ah, that's right. All right.
I knew Bavariak only by chance, because he happened to be a friend of my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, and he were at the same time professors at Innsbruck in the 1980s. And actually, it may also amuse you, used to climb mountains together here in the mountains, and even did, which was still possible in the 1880s, do some first ascents together to some of the peaks the mountains were still explored. And before my grandfather died, maternal grandfather, I repeat, in 1910, I used to meet Böhm Bawerk in his house. Before I knew what the word economics meant, he was just a close friend of my parents and grandparents, but he died in 1915, so even when he died I was 16. I used later to meet his widow still, who had been a maternal friend of my mother. My mother called his widow aunt, because in the years here together in Salzburg.
Who do you regard as the most important of the graduates of Böhm Bawerk's seminar? Mises, of course, would be one famous graduate. Schumpeter was one. I believe Karl Pribram was one.
Yes.
Were there any
but
other?
Karl Pribram was not really a theoretician at all.
I understand that, but he was an important
Or Böhm Bawerk.
writer.
Well, I'm not sure whether Mises' main successor, Hans Meyer, he may or may not have been. And then there were a few other quite influential economists who were not strictly Austrians, particularly a man called Alfred Ammon. But then, as I said, these various later socialist leaders, Otto Bauer, who became one of the leaders of the Austrian Marxists, Hilferding, who later played a great role in Germany, Emil Lederer, who, when the Germans in the 1920s had to appoint a new professor in Berlin, the one who took a socialist but had to take it from the Austrian School, and so took this rather insignificant Lederer, which was a course by Schumpeter America. He had counted on the chair in Berlin and didn't get it. When he didn't get it, he went off to Harvard. And that is roughly the ground. On this point, the exact content of Böhm Bawerk's seminar, my former assistant, Leube, who is now in Stanford, seems to have got some information. It's the only point on which I have no problem. It's very curious. Among the generation just above me, the experience of Böhm Bawerk's seminar was the great experience of their youth, would all the time talk about, but there are no details. The atmosphere, as it were familiar to me, but when, as you now ask me, give me some information, I know no facts. I know what names were occasionally mentioned. And
Do you know?
It certainly, in the Vienna of the 1920s, the reference, we discussed this in Böhm Bawerk's seminar before the war, was a constant event. This was a great experience of the generation just before me, who would constantly remember, how interesting when we are all discussing this together.
Now, were these seminars always held at the university?
These were all happening at the university, and it brings back to this. In the first floor of the West Wing, the left wing, let's call it, if you look at it from the Ringstraße,
Yes.
first floor of this was the center of law and economics.
And is that still where?
That's still where it is,
Okay.
yes. The only other center, which for the later period is the offices of Mises, and incidentally myself and Haberler, which is in the Chamber of Commerce of Vienna. Still he left in 1934. To owe his living from being one of the secretaries of the Chamber of Commerce. He became there the source of two appointments in the same building, not in the same office. Or well, in the same office in a certain case, yes. He got Haberle post as librarian of the Chamber of Commerce. Well, so long Haberle remained in Vienna, he worked in the same building. My story is a little more complicated. When I had graduated in 1921, arose in Vienna a new temporary office to carry out certain conditions of the peace treaty of 1918. The settlement of pre-war private debts between the nations. Mises, on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce, was one of the directors of this new office. It was very attractive to new people, because if a young man who had studied law and spoke two foreign languages could get a much better position in the other circumstances, I was one of these fortunate men and came, but that again please is off the record, but for your amusement, came to Mises with a letter of introduction from Mises recommending me for this position. And Mises, I still can see him before me, reading Mises' letter of introduction, looking at me. Mises says, "You're a promising young economist. I've never seen you at my lectures." Still, he gave me the job. And so for the next 5 years, interrupted by a visit to America, was working under him. And then when I brought back from America the new idea of trade predictions, the sort of thing which the Harvard Economic Barometer had developed in the early 20s, Mises helped me to create in the same building an institute for business cycle research.
About what year?
That was the second part of the 20s. The first part of the 20s I worked with him in that office. And from 27 to 31, exactly till I went to London, I was acting as the organizer of this institute, beginning as myself and the secretary, and gradually expanding it, getting in Morgenstern as my collaborator, who afterwards took over from me.
Now, can you locate the Chamber of Commerce?
I will in a moment.
Okay.
The Chamber of Commerce building then became so important, because during the 1920s until he left Vienna in 30-40, when I had already been gone, Mises' office was the place of a so-called private seminar that took place at the Chamber of Commerce during the academic year twice a month. Now, just in Vienna, which are interest, while the coffee houses, both of them, you may use the one which has survived as representative for the other which has not.
Now, this is significant, though. Now, you are saying that Mises teaching outside of the university
The advanced
for
teaching,
advanced teaching, students did not get credit for this.
nothing at all. It was a purely discussion club.
Who are some of the people who came that you remember or ever heard of that would be important for us?
Well, first of an intermediate generation between Mises and my own. People were still in the Böhm-Bawerk seminar. A man called Striegel, whom we all expected to succeed to the professorship, but who died young. And another man whose essays will appear shortly, called Schams, S-C-H-A-M-S. Then comes my generation, which I am slightly the oldest, although I have one contemporary and one who might be able to interview, a lady called Steffi Braun, who lives in New York.
How would that be spelled? Do you know?
Well, she now spells it English, B-R-O-W-N. She used to be B-R-A-U-N when I knew her, Stephanie, in Austria. I have got a address book upstairs. I might give you one or two of the addresses later. She, I believe, is the only surviving member of my own age. There used to be another woman of the same age, was secretary of the Bank Association, the name of Lisa, L-I-E-S-E-R, Lene Lisa, all have been dead for many years. Then comes Haberler, only a year my junior. Then to take first the better-known figures, Machnut, who is another 2 years younger, Morgenstern, who was at Princeton, well, you might say it was a group of a total of up to 20 people, of whom about 12 would regularly meet twice a month in Mises' actual Chamber of Commerce office, without any formal connection with the university, all ex-university students, discussing, I believe, predominantly questions of scientific methodology rather than particular problems, even if we start out with a very practical, concrete problem of the time, would very soon be off with the conflict between the different schools of economics. Later, in the early 1930s, means the last 4 years, when it still met, it became a considerable point of attraction for foreign students. That was after I had left. I don't remember, but I know that during the later years, French, English, American students used to come in for a term, take part in these discussions, and during these final years of the Austrian School in Austria, it was the center, not only for the Austrian School itself, which attracted students from all over the world to join into the discussion. That I knew mainly by hearsay, because I was the first to leave Vienna before emigration in any sense had yet started. Because I never imagined that I was emigrating. But if at the age of 32 you're offered a professorship at the University of London, you take it. I never considered that this was moving myself outside Austria. It was just the first decisive step in my academic career. It was the world which prevented me from ever returning after this.
Now let me ask you a a question that may embarrass you, but it must be asked. If Mises was attracting English-speaking students in the early 30s, or perhaps even some in the late 20s, yet Mises is known in the English-speaking world in the 30s only because of you, really. This is in production.
It's not as simple as this.
Well, for those of us who remember it, that's how. So maybe you can clarify.
The decisive person was Lionel Robbins, the later Lord Robbins, at the London School of Economics.
The question is simply, we know of Robbins' early work today in retrospect because of the nature and significance, which I think was 32.
No, I believe it was 30 already.
Perhaps you're right. But that is, we don't think of that as being a book promoting Mises or the Austrians. So there must be some other influence you have in mind there that was more important than your, because prices in production.
You know, by that time, 31, Mises was still a relatively minor figure, confined to a particular field. He was a man who had done two things, a theory of money and the system of socialism. His great book, his philosophical essay, came out even in German only in 1938, and the American version only in the 1940s. That established him as a great social philosopher. But by the early 1930s, Mises was internationally, so far as he was known at all, which is limited, but known to people like Robbins as a man who had done a distinctive contribution to the theory of money, developing manner, and developing most effectively his criticism of socialism.
But for those of us who are young or starting out, and we look at a man's career who in his 30s, I gather, wrote Theory of Money and Credit, which in retrospect seems to be a masterpiece, I mean, a path-breaking book. And then the Theory of Socialism, which influenced you and Robbins and Ropke and I don't know how many others, but a lot of very bright young men of his era, and turned them from socialism. How is it in 1931, which is 19 years after Money and Credit and 9 years after socialism, why is it that he was still unknown in the profession?
None of his books were cited.
That's a good reason.
See, it was Robbins and I who arranged in London for the translation.
But what I want to know is, why, now you were invited to be a professor at the London School, or was it the London School of Economics?
Yes.
But why wasn't Mises invited? Couldn't speak
Well, you see,
English?
I had done a thing which none else had done. I had, before the beginning of the Rockefeller Fellowships, in 1923, on my own risk, gone to America, spent 15 months in America, and was, in consequence, speaking fluent English. That's number one. It's not the whole story. That was a precondition. Mises could hardly have done this at the time, not my other colleagues. But two, I had, while in America, devoted a lot of time to the criticism of a peculiar kind of American underconsumption analysis, which was very similar to what Keynes later produced. This was Foster and Catchings. I don't know if you still remember these names. I spent a great, and was absolutely ready to criticize any underconsumption theory which then Keynes produced. And I pounced upon him, completely equipped to deal with this.
This would have been about what year?
What?
What year that you began to interact with Keynes?
Well, I'd begun still in the States in 24, but I was working all the time on these sort of problems was preparing, and that's the third of four elements which I have to mention. I had started on writing a great treatise on money, which I never completed, but for which I proposed to start with 10 chapters on the history of monetary theory and policy, of which by the end of the 20s I had written the first 4 chapters dealing with the development in England between 1690 and 1900. So when I came to London, and I will explain this in a moment, I proved to know much more about the history of English monetary theory than any of the English professors, which caused a great impression. And the fourth unerhört subject is that when I gave in Vienna my initial lecture as a Privatdozent, I chose for my subject this kind of consumption theory which had just become acute in England, and Robbins could read German. That's a very almost unique factor. An English professor who could read German literature. That's a good luck that he pounced on my subject. This is the things we need at the moment to fight Keynes. So I was brought in for this purpose, produced a course of lectures which was original, which suggested more knowledge of the history of English theory than anybody else. Was sympathetic by Robbins, who had been influenced by the Austrian School. We at once understood each other. Was combination of accidents to my appointment in London. I mean, it was luck from beginning to end.
But it was prices and production which brought the Austrian trade cycle theory to the attention of our world.
To say a fifth point, equally accidental, the invitation reached me when I had for the first time a clear picture of this theory, but had not yet gone into all the complicated details. As I've started working it out in an elaborate treatise, I would have encountered any number of complications, would have produced a very difficult treatise. The invitation met me at the moment when I could just quickly tell the story as a general survey as I then saw it, without yet being appeared, then to give you the main illustration, which later held up the development. For my simple exposition, I could operate with a grave simplification in Böhm-Bawerk, operating with an average period of production. Now, the average period of production is a beautiful simplification, but doesn't help you at all. A general exposition I could give as soon as I became aware it's not a question of a single average period of production, but a immediately complex structure. I would have got, if I had been aware of this in 1931, I could not have given a beautiful, simple exposition, but it would have confused everybody. But I was myself yet aware of the difficulties. So I gave these incredibly successful lectures, but it was not really the merit. It was a situation in which this particular set of lectures hit in London. I mean, I expected nothing less than that 4 lectures I give in London would lead to an invitation. And of course, in the first instance, it produced only an invitation for a visiting professorship for 1 year. But I fitted in so well, and Aaron Robbins and I became very close friends. We worked beautiful together, and from 31 till 40, we were really thinking together and working together.
Was the London...
Then I'm afraid Larry fell under Keynes' influence.
Well, that happened to a number of your contemporaries. But let me ask you this. The London School was originally a Fabian institution. How was it that by 1931, you and Robbins were both on the faculty.
It's a person, I hold it due to the person of Edwin Cannon. The Webbs were in a sense very decent. They wanted a good theoretician who was an independent mind, and were so convinced that unprejudiced study of economics must lead to socialism. They made the mistake of somebody who wouldn't at all. And he who was the main professor, and Foxwell, who had the professorship of money banking, were completely separated from the Fabian part. And all through my years, although in a way Lasky and I had something in common, we were both great book collectors. But apart from this, we had of course nothing in common at all. We hardly spoke the same language. Don't ask me to begin to tell stories about LSE. It was extremely, because of this comic place, and the extraordinary person of Harold Lasky, was a most peculiar place.
Give us a couple of stories. We need at least one or two.
Harold Lasky was a pathological problem. Means even among his friends today recognize that he was a pathological liar who just couldn't. Well, if you have time, we'll tell you one or two stories, which are everybody with. First, from our book collecting experience. Book collectors are like fishermen. They always have found something unique. But Harold Lasky took the following forms. He would come one midday, when we always met after lunch in the senior common room, enthusiastic, just been to Charing Cross Road, and in one of these boxes there were some beautiful French duodecimo volumes of the 18th century that turned them over all the religious stuff. Suddenly found that the back of one was thicker than the other. So I asked the man, how much is it? 6 pence each. So put down a shilling, took the 2 volumes, slit it open, and out fell 4 letters exchanged between Rousseau and Voltaire. They were never published. That was typical for the man.
He just made the story up?
Completely.
Amazing.
All the later, when there are 2 memorable occasions in the same room, even before we moved to Cambridge in 1939, in preparation of a probable outbreak of war, as in 1940, before we had all moved by bombing in London started, both Lasky and I were spending the evenings of the days we were teaching. We were still coming up from London for 2 days a week in the house of one colleague, Lancelot Beales. Now, the first occasion was only very remarkable because Harold Lasky was lecturing to us about the beauties of the Russian system, and was interrupted by the announcement of the news. We were always listening to the BBC, I believe, at 7:30. The news came through of the Stalin-Ribbentrop Pact. And afterwards, Lasky behaved as he had never in his life said a good word. Bolsheviks, the most abominable creatures for us. And a change in the man, he seemed to have remembered what he had been done for the preceding 20 years of his life. But a year later, in exactly the same position, they're again sitting together after dinner, listening to the news. Harold had just been to his home Manchester and had his bombing attack. And on that occasion, he had been very shaken because one bomb had fallen close to his hotel had badly shaken him. Within 3 weeks, I've heard every stage of this story had become a story that his hotel had been hit, and he had pushed his bed to 4 floors into the cellar.
The London School, was it mostly people, students, in terms of students, were they Fabians? Were they just students trying to get a degree? What was the motivation to come to the London School in the 30s?
Well, you have to distinguish between faculty and students. Faculty was this enormous difference between economists on the one hand and political scientists and sociologists on the other. In between, there were the lawyers, the geographers, the economic historians, who were either neutral or the usual type would be a very mild Fabian. People of the Bloomsbury group, people like Eileen Power, who stuck in the Bloomsbury group. Very nice and decent people in their way, not doctrinaire.
I had no idea she was in any way connected with Eileen Power was connected with Bloomsbury?
Oh, yes.
I didn't know that.
She happened to live there. The Bloomsbury people were neighbors. She knew them all.
All right, okay.
In this sense. I don't think she was any active, but they were all very familiar to her.
All right, go ahead.
And Tawney was, of course, also a Fabian, but a man with whom you could talk, not a doctrinaire. A very interesting man. Personally, I liked Tawney. Harold Laski was always a jerk, and I could never take Harold Laski. But at that time, people took him still seriously. Now, even his party fellows, even before his death, take him seriously as a thinker. He must have been, as a very young man, very brilliant. But by the time I knew him, he was not.
When I want to bring up something you have mentioned in a couple of places in your writings. It is significant, but I want to ask a further question. You write of the time that you spent preparing a review of Keynes's treatise on money. And then once it was published, Keynes had said to you, oh, well, I've changed my views. So then when the general theory came out, you decided at that time that it would be unwise to spend the same amount of time to critique the book only to have him do the same thing over. Now, those of us who live on the far side of general theory suspect that had you published, it might have been different. I'm of the opinion that it would not have been different, that the times were just moving in the direction of Keynes. In retrospect, what do you think?
You know, it's a much more complicated story. I myself put it in the way in which you were now quoted. But by being disillusioned by Keynes so easily taken, oh, it no longer matters. I've had a later experience with him of the same sort, which I will tell you later, but a much more complicated position. I by then had become very much aware that in that simplified form, based on the Bawerk's, as I mentioned before, average period of production, my theory could not really be carried through. So I'd come to the conclusion I must first build up an adequate theory of capital for a return to industrial fluctuations. That took me 7 years to do so, but even then I only published the first static volume, assuming I would go over to the dynamic part. But then a very curious position arose. But then war had broken out. And Keynes was almost the only sensible man who was willing and and able to protect us against inflation. So during the war years, I was supporting Keynes against his supporters as the one man who actually did succeed in getting him through the war without inflation. So during the war on practical politics, I was on Keynes' side and didn't want to discredit him. An attack on Keynes during the war years would have been, I believe, was right. I was grateful for his existence. And that I was in a great measure right proves my last experience with Keynes, a story I've told many times, but I do not mind repeating. A few weeks before his death, that means it must have been in about January 1946, I was still treated as an honorary fellow of King's College, as he had lived through the war in Cambridge. Keynes had given me rooms in his college. And after I had returned to Cambridge, I still came occasionally to King's to dine there. And on the very large occasion, when two things occurred which I usually tell as illustration of the respect in which Keynes was a genius. That meant we happened to sit together in the smoking room of the college, reading the daily newspapers. On stage, I asked him, "Tell me, aren't you getting along with what John Robinson and Richard Kahn are making of your theories? Danger are clearly inflation." And he burst out, "Oh, they are just fools. You know, my theories are very important in the deflation period of the 1930s. But trust me, if my theories ever become dangerous, I'm going to turn public opinion around." 6 weeks he was later and couldn't do it.
And that's a significant story. But in retrospect, after the pure theory of capital, you never went back. I mean, The Road to Serfdom came out. It was an extraordinary success. Political, philosophical book. And it seemed that turned your interest to a wholly new field.
Perfectly true. I became much more interested in fact, in a way, as Mises had been, but not following Mises, in the differences of the philosophical approach which led to, of the social sciences, which led to different conclusions. I mean, it became particularly acute because Keynes, against his intentions, had stimulated the development of economics. I was convinced that not only his particular conclusions, but the whole foundation of macroeconomics was wrong. And so I wanted to demonstrate that we had to return to microeconomics, that this whole prejudice supported by the natural scientists, they could deduce anything from measurable magnitudes, the effects of aggregates and averages, they came to fascinate me much more. I felt in a way that the thing which I am now prepared to do, I don't know there's anybody else who can do this particular task. I rather hoped that what I did, capital theory and others, would be continued by others. This was a new opening, which was much more fascinating. The other would have meant working for a result which I already knew, but I had to prove it, which was very dull. The other thing was an open problem. How does economics really look like when you recognize it as a prototype of a new kind of science of complex phenomena, which could not employ the simple model of mechanics or physics, but had to deal with what then I described as mere pattern predictions, certain limited predictions. That was so much more fascinating as an intellectual problem.
And yet, capital theory, in the Austrian sense, ended with pure theory of capital, wouldn't you say, in retrospect?
Very largely. Nobody has done what I hoped to would be done by others.
I mean, it's almost 50 years. It's 45 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And there's been nothing. In fact, I'll be quite honest. That's the one book of yours that gives me the most trouble.
How much this is true, I became very much aware about only 4 years ago. When I asked for permission to give a lecture on the same day, January 1981, exactly 50 years after my Prices of Production lectures, under the chairmanship of Lionel Robbins, under the title of Goods and Services, this whole question of the variation of the time stream leading up to a product. And published only in a German translation. It was supposed to be a chapter of the English I'm working. But I became very much aware of what you say. That in effect, we are still where we were 50 years ago. The crucial point has not yet come. Well, it would be unfair to say sufficiently accepted. It has not yet been presented in a form that is fully satisfactory, even to me.
I have a question. There is a PhD thesis that was done at New York University looking at the historical evidence in the United States to support the Hayekian theory of the business cycle. Have you seen that?
Which one is it? I've seen quite a number of that kind of thing.
I just, Robertson or something.
Not O'Driscoll.
No. This is much more recent.
This was like 1982.
Well, I probably only a little seen it from the outside.
Well,
there's now such a flood of books by Hayekians that I can no longer master it.
To what do you attribute the late reaction? Now you're the dean of the school by dint of biology. You've survived. There is this wave of interest now.
Well, he got the Nobel Prize in '74. That
No, the Nobel Prize had very little effect. From 74 till about 80, oh yes, the external effects and so on, but I could not yet feel that we had stirred the interest of the younger generation. And for the past 5 years, in such a flood, I can no longer follow it. I mean, I don't think I'm exaggerating. Get every month a new book dealing with my problems, and I'm concerned with my own task. I can't even read them.
Oh. Do you have any explanation? Is it? Here is my guess, but it is only a guess, that at last the question of the Keynesian aggregates is now being taken seriously, and you wound up as the man who 50 years ago first challenged it.
Yes, in a way, even simple. It is a disappointment with Keynes, which has turned into respect to me. In the mere fact of unemployment combined with inflation at the same time suddenly disillusioned people.
And that's 79 and 80. That late 70s period. Now let me ask a personal question. 10 years ago, now I'm going again by a 10-year memory, but I think I've got it close. 10 years ago, and I think it was in February, Reason magazine published an interview with you. And you made approximately the following statement. Fortunately, the worst prediction of your life. You talked about what you thought would come, which was unemployment, inflationary crisis, price controls, the command economy. And you said, we will see it within 10 years, but I will not see it, and I am thankful that I won't. Now, one, you're still here, and second, at least with respect to price controls and the command economy, we did not see it.
No, it's never become a spade at that.
Why do you...
Well, I believe the answer is in the United States. that there was then already underway a stream of young men I did not know, whom I began to discover very soon after that. But the second thing is, I must also admit, that was done in a period when I was either still in or only recovering from a period which in a sense might be called depression, although the medical diagnosis that I was suffering from depression was pure nonsense. It's now been cleared up that I had about 69 and a little earlier 2 heart attacks which knocked me out, one for 1 year and one for 5 years. I was unable to work from 69 to early 74, and not being able to work made me frightfully depressed and pessimistic. I have not been cured, as some of my friends maliciously suggest, by the Nobel Prize. I had already started publishing again early in the summer of 74 before I had any idea. But that before 74, I was for almost 5 years out of action intellectually, or at least unable to do any original work. I did such things as, for instance, that survey of the history of liberalism for an Italian encyclopedia, which has since been published in English translation, which not only just reproduces my old knowledge, but even makes some awful blunders of pure memory. If you know my writing at all, you will see how absurd it is to write an intellectual history of liberalism and to forget to even mention Lord Acton, who was one of my great figures. But that thing could happen to me at the time when I was merely reviving things I knew without actually thinking it. Sometimes I feel these 5 years have been a period of rest.
I want to go back now to some questions about the students of Mises. You maintained your commitment to the Austrian perspective generally. However, you may have disagreed on some points with Mises, but you're still an Austrian economist.
Schumpeter, no.
Schumpeter, of course, was a friend of Mises, or if not a friend, at least a colleague, an intellectual peer. Haberler abandoned his open
Haberler has
commitment.
never been greatly interested in the philosophical basis of it.
What about Macklov? We don't think of him as an Austrian today, though he was.
How about Alvin Hansen?
He was and he was not. He knew it all, but he was not basically a philosophical thinker.
Was it Keynes's work, or was it the reaction regarding the length of the Depression? Robbins is a case in point. You cannot get him to discuss the Great Depression. That book has fallen into Robbins' memory hole. It's not there anymore. Was it a disillusionment about the theory as a result of either Keynes or the Depression that you think may have... Well, Alvin Hansen is another.
Alvin Hansen.
Alvin Hansen became the teacher of Samuelson, of all things.
And he was one of your students, right?
No, he was my contemporary in age.
But he was influenced by your thinking.
Yeah.
He was at one stage influenced me, but Hansen, I'm afraid I don't take him seriously. He was a man quick to learn. He was not a real theoretical. But let me get to the crucial point. Now, what I see only now clearly is a problem of my relation to Mises. which began with my 1937 article on economics and knowledge, which was an attempt to persuade Mises himself that when he asserted that the market theory was a priori, he was wrong. That what was a priori was only the logic of individual action, but the moment you passed from this to the interaction of many people, you entered into the empirical field. Curiously enough, while Mises was very resentful of any criticism by his pupils and temporarily broke both with Machlup and Habermas because they had criticized the thing. He took my critique silently and even approved the article as if he had not been aware that it was a criticism of his own views. I cannot explain this. But my view has gone very much further. My reason. I believe I can now even explain why what I admit is a masterly socialism has not been really effective. Because Mises remained in the end himself a rationalist utilitarian. And with a rationalist utilitarianism, a rejection of socialism is irreconcilable. Socialism, the capitalism, presumes that apart from our rational insight, we possess a traditional endowment of morals, which has been tested by evolution, but not designed by our intelligence. We have never invented private property because we understood its consequences, nor have we ever invented the family. It so happened that those traditions, essentially religious tradition, and I am as much anarchist as Mises was, but I must admit it's the two decisive traditions which made it possible for us to build up an order which extends our vision, cannot be the result of our intellectual insight, but must be the result of a moral tradition, which, as I now put it, is the result of group selection, not of individual selection. Something which we can exposed interpret. But Mises postulate, if we are strictly rational and decide also we can see that socialism is wrong, is fake. If we remain strict rationalists, utilitarians, that implies we can arrange everything according to our pleasure. So Mises never could free himself from that fundamental philosophy in which we have all grown up, all of our mission, that reason can do everything better than mere habit. From this he could never lose himself. In this respect, although I accept nearly everything of his criticism of socialism, I now understand why it has not been fully effective. Because in his case, it's still based on the fundamental mistake of rationalism and socialism, that we have the intellectual power to arrange everything rationally, which is an outright conflict with his assertion. In one place he says we can't do it. In another place he argues, being rational people, we must try to do it.
That's a significant difference.
Let me ask you, what was the basis? I mean, at seminars, was there a discussion of moral philosophy, of religion? What was the basis for the agnosticism in, I think, among...
It was common among us to begin with.
Oh, it was.
You see, in a way, Vienna is the origin of so many schools of its own, which were dominant in the 1920s. And one fundamental and influential, which we all were partly called, was logical positivism. In fact, Mises' brother, of course, Richard von Mises, one of the leading figures. He and I all grew up in this Ernst Mach philosophy, that ultimately everything must be rationally justified. Till we both discovered that apart from our capacity of rationally organizing things, we rely also on something which we have never rationally invented, certain moral tradition. Let me tell you an amusing episode. It takes a little introduction. Even the Catholic Church has become very sensible, at least some members in it. And a very great man, the present Cardinal of Vienna, acts for the Vatican as a liaison between church and science. And in this effort, he had about 2 years ago organized a very remarkable event to be organized by cardinals of the Roman Catholic Church, a meeting on evolution on the 100th anniversary of the death of Charles Darwin. Imagine, organized by the Cardinal Catholic Church. On occasion, I was asked to give a lecture on cultural evolution, as distinct from biological evolution. With the Cardinal, the chair before me, I made the rather rude remark as conclusion. I'm afraid even we agnostics must admit that we owe our civilization to superstitions. Of the Cardinal made first a bitter face, and I apologize. No, it's too hard a word. Let's call it on symbolic truth, which has suddenly embraced me, and on the term symbolic truth, which are not rationally justifiable, which have prevailed, proved themselves in tradition, we are suddenly in complete agreement. He agreed. Of course, the truths of the religion are different from the truths of science. If you admit that civilization depends on symbolic truths, as you I call it, which are essential for the preservation of human civilization, there's no conflict between us anymore.
Now, in the 20s, that was not perceived. This is a later Hayek speaking
This is what I'm now
than the Hayek of the 1920s.
This is the fatal conceit on which I'm working. The whole idea, which is basic, that part of our order of cooperation is based not on deliberate designs which we understand, but on traditions which have prevailed, because they've enabled more people to live than other traditions. A sort of quasi-Darwinian solution, which however differs from biological Darwinism, and not being based on selection of individuals, because the individuals can never perceive these effects. They are beyond their range of vision. They only show themselves in the active success of the group. Using for this purpose now the conception of an extended order operation. By extended, I mean an order which transcends our vision. Just the simple fact that we're all working for people whom we do not know and being supplied by people whom we do not know. We live in an order which is, in this sense, not perceivable to us. We produce, through habits whose significance we do not understand, an order which has become essential for our survival in present numbers. This is the main theme of the book I'm preparing, and which, because it leads in so many philosophical problems, it's taken me much longer to solve. The book has been in draft for at least 4 years. That's the first. Because the fatal conceit. The fatal conceit meaning that the whole civilization is a creation of the human reason, that we have created it in knowing what we are doing. That I'm denying. And the crucial part is the 3 volumes of the fatal conceit of morals, economics, and politics. And the moral part, which has led me into the problems I've just been explaining, which have delayed the book so much. I had hoped to send the first volume to the printers before this summer. I'm still hanging with a very amusing chapter. The one chapter I have to rewrite now begins with the problem. Why has it been true for the last 100 years that the intelligent a person was, the more likely it was that he would be a socialist? Which is roughly true. I don't think you can deny it. Among the natural...
But not now.
It's improved. Among the physicists, it's almost still true. The biologists saw... Einstein was an out-and-out. Einstein is one of my principal novels.
I understand, but I believe in the last years it has begun to shift, and you're partially responsible.
But I still start with a paradigm, which is a Nobel Prize lecture by Jacques Monod, the French biologist, which explicitly said, science has now definitely proved to us it's nonsense to believe anything except what is empirically demonstrable. Going out at last, that all traditional morals is nonsense, we must build society on the morals which we invent. This I take to my...
That's destructive.
But that's bad biology. It's not even good epistemology anymore.
In biology it's already bad, but in... There are very few physicists, even at present,